Howdy, friends. This is Matthew Sewell, and you're listening to episode 110 of the Popecast, a history of the papacy, the only podcast about popes where you'll find non-boring stories on the successors of St. Peter and a reminder that all the world's problems have happened plenty of times before. Now imagine, a corpse is 9 months dead, but is suddenly exhumed, propped up on a throne in full papal vestments, and placed on trial for various alleged offenses. A teenage deacon is assigned to answer questions on its behalf, and the present pope is ignoring the deacon and screaming at the body. Well, that's our pope today. The man who lost his mind, his papacy, and eventually his life over a dead guy. This week on the Popecast, it's the Pope who put a corpse on trial, number 113, Pope Stephen VI. Now, a quick note before we get into the actual content. If you're watching on YouTube, please be sure to subscribe if you haven't already to the Popecast channel and leave a comment after listening to let us know what you liked most about the episode. And consider sharing this with a friend, especially if you like the episode. If you've been listening to the show for a while, just think of one friend who might benefit, who might enjoy the show as well. We'd really, really appreciate it. Also, while the Popecast is free to listen to, it does take time and effort to produce. And I have big, big plans for where the show will be taken in the coming weeks and months. First and foremost, again, as I mentioned in the last episode, making this background a little bit more interesting, different guests, things of that nature. So if you feel called to monetarily support the work we do here at the Popecast and Today in Papal History, you can do so over at popes.substack.com. That's popes.substack.com. By becoming a paying subscriber for as little as $6 a month or $60 a year. Or, if you feel so bold, you can join the even more elite rank of Pontifical Superfans, our founders tier. And on that note, I'd like to give a special shout out to longtime fan of the show, Tyson, for being the newest Pontifical Superfan. Now back to the show. Stephen was born in Rome sometime in the early 9th century and was the son of a priest named John. That's literally all that's known about his early life, outside of his sordid deeds in the year leading up to his demise. Maybe that's because of the time in which he lived, and maybe that's because he was just that unsavory a character. Indeed, one of the worst to ever sit in the chair of St. Peter. Where history picks up Stephen in earnest is his appointment as Bishop of Anagni by Pope Formosus. Anagni is a city just southeast of Rome by a little less than 50 miles. And since ancient Roman times, it's been an influential hub of power and influence, in peaceful summers housing Roman emperors in the old days and pontiffs throughout the Middle Ages, and being a site of more than a few battles and diplomatic parleys over the centuries as well. Anagni even produced 4 popes herself, among them Innocent III, perhaps the most powerful pope in history from a military standpoint, and Boniface VIII, who famously followed the elderly St. Celestine V, but more famously uttered the line in his bull, Unum Sanctum, quote, "We declare, say, define, and pronounce that it is altogether necessary for salvation for every human creature to be subject to the Roman pontiff," end quote. Which, I mean, would be considered based on Instagram, but on the whole probably isn't super helpful, especially not today, but I digress. Anyway, this was the territory that Stephen was sent to oversee by Pope Formosus, and though history has forgotten the exact reason why, Stephen was apparently not at all pleased with the appointment. Because Formosus's reign began in the year 891, it was at most 5 years there before Stephen ascended to the papal throne himself. Formosus died in early April of 896 and was followed briefly by Pope Boniface VI, who had the second shortest papacy in history, in fact, at just 16 days, and it was actually even the shortest ever by a pope who had already been consecrated. After that, it was Stephen's turn, because the papacy in those days could be easily influenced by the secular powers of the day. The modern conclave system wouldn't be instituted for another century and a half. It's believed that Stephen was helped in his ascendancy by the powerful house of Spoleto, from which the Holy Roman Emperor, Guy of Spoleto, had been crowned by the prior Stephen, Stephen V, in 891, and from which his son, Lambert, had been crowned co-emperor by Formosus in 892 at his father's urging. Don't be fooled, though. Formosus was no friend of Lambert. In fact, when Guy, Lambert's dad, died in 894, the Pope decided to throw out Sonny Boy's coronation altogether, pretty much, and crown Arnulf of Carinthia instead, He was a Frankish Carolingian king descended from Charlemagne, and made him Holy Roman Emperor instead. Now, I'll pause here for a bit of historical context, because what happened next requires just a bit of a retrospective. The feud between the Spoletans, the Dukes of Spoleto, and the Carolingians had spanned decades by this point. Formosus, for his part, he was known legitimately as having been a virtuous and upright man, an administrator, serving under several popes until he had risen to the throne himself, and he had met Arnulf on a trip to Constantinople while serving as a papal ambassador. He apparently liked what he saw in the ambitious young king, and they stayed in some form of contact. But this wasn't really welcome news to Pope John VIII, who came to power in 872. He and Formosus initially were pals, so John had sent his trusty cardinal, for instance, as part of an entourage to invite King Charles the Bald of France to Rome, where he could be crowned emperor in place of the dearly departed Louis II of Italy. But before long, John VIII opted to excommunicate Formosus on false pretenses, along with another group of men who had all fled Rome in fear of retribution. Though we'll never know for sure, it seemed most likely that John VIII saw Formosus as a threat, simple jealousy. The latter, of course, was one of the most trusted allies to both of the prior two pontiffs, and it's said that the two were at odds politically to boot. Even though Formosus didn't seem to oppose the appointment of Charles as emperor, the accusations that John had leveled at him, that Formosus coveted the archbishopric of Bulgaria, where he had been a successful evangelist for years, that he coveted that of the papacy himself, and that he'd also robbed convents before leaving Rome. All of those seemed out of character given his priors. Those were enough to quote-unquote justify Formosus being excommunicated and stripped of his clerical titles to boot. It's entirely likely that the company Formosus ended up keeping while he was in exile was guilt by association, which we cover more in, I think, episode 87 on Formosus himself. But either way, the Catholic Encyclopedia notes that, quote, such charges made against a man who was religious, moral, ascetic, and intellectual can only be referred to party spirit, end quote. Perhaps a 9th century way of saying fake news. Formosus was rehabilitated, though, by Pope Marinus I, which paved the way for his own election 2 papacies later. Okay, now back to Stephen. Unfortunately, Arnulf had died around the same time as Formosus, paving the way for Lambert then to reclaim his title alongside his mother, the Empress Agiltrude, who sounded like a real looker with a name like that. Mother and son, though, returned to Rome, presumably arranged for Stephen's election, and may have even been the architects of what happened next. Pope Stephen VI had received his coronation on May 22nd, 896, and he set to work persecuting any partisan of Pope Formosus that he could find. I really cannot emphasize how little love there was between the two of these men. Who knows why they were such enemies? But at any rate, he had the fans of Formosus driven from the city, tortured in some cases, and even killed. And then in January 897, he convened the event now infamously known as the Cadaver Synod. Formosus, laid to rest by that point for 9 months, had his corpse unceremoniously exhumed, dressed in papal vestments, and placed on a throne where Stephen VI conducted a show trial in order to disgrace his sworn enemy and papal predecessor. A deacon was assigned to give answers for the dead pope, but it was all moot. Stephen ignored the deacon, incessantly hurled indecencies at the rotting body of Formosus, accusing him and ultimately condemning him for many things that had been disproven years earlier, acting as a bishop while deposed, and in particular accepting the role as Bishop of Rome when he was already bishop of another diocese, since, technically by canon law standards, the switching of dioceses was prohibited in those days. Although, even the cursory listener could understand, wait, nobody could be Bishop of Rome beforehand, so if that were the case, if that were true, then only priests could be elected bishops of Rome. But several times throughout history, already at that point, had other bishops been elected and moved to Bishop of Rome. So it was all trumped up charges. At any rate, the kangaroo court convicted Formosus, and Stephen VI had his body stripped of its papal vestments. The 3 fingers on his right hand, which were used for blessings, were cut off, and he was dressed in the clothing of a simple layman before being thrown into the Tiber River. Now, unsurprisingly, public opinion of Stephen VI took a nosedive after the macabre spectacle, and perhaps was kicked off by the Almighty himself. There were rumors that Formosus's body even while it was still in the Tiber, before it had been fished out and buried more ceremoniously, had been producing miracles at people who were going and maybe praying at the spot where he was thrown in. That's happened in the cases of many saints. Formosus is not considered a saint, canonized saint, I should clarify, but still, that's kind of the rumor. But then shortly after the trial as well, a devastating earthquake hit Rome, which Matthew Bunsen writes was, quote, as sure a sign of divine displeasure as the Romans could receive, end quote. The brutality, murders, and then the devilish stroke of desecration caused a Roman mob to ultimately demand that Stephen VI be deposed and imprisoned, which his partisans from the House of Spoleto ultimately obliged. So he was removed from office and jailed, where he was strangled to death in August 897. And so ended the life of one of the most bizarro world pontiffs in history. It's guys like Stephen VI who I think of anytime someone complained about something that a particular recently departed pope allegedly did or said, afterward claiming that he was the worst. No way any pope nowadays could crack the top 50 in worst popes when guys like Stephen VI walked the earth back in the day. And yet, the church endured. Well, that's it for today's episode. Thanks for listening. Just a reminder that if you like what you hear, please be sure again to hit that subscribe button. If you're on YouTube, leave us a comment with what you liked most. If you're listening on iTunes or Spotify, leave us a 5-star rating and review. We'd love to hear from you there as well. And lastly, if you'd like to support the work we do here and ensure that the Popecast is around for many years to come, the best place to do that, again, monetarily, is by becoming a paid subscriber over at Today in Papal History, which can be found at popes.substack.com, and the link is in the description below as well. Obviously, the show and the newsletter will always be free to readers, but time is very precious, so your gifts in that regard allow for more time to produce the show and write more posts on these forgotten corners of papal history. Well, again, that's it for this week. You might have guessed, there are no existent writings from Pope Stephen VI, and I think that, again, has more to do with the thing that makes him such a villain, and less so that he lived in the late 800s. So we'll leave you with that. As we head out today, let us pray for the soul of Pope Stephen VI. I hope he has long got his eternal reward and done his penance and is waiting for us in eternity. We hope that for everybody, but at any rate, still pray for him. Give thanks for the witness of Pope Formosus, and above all, never forget, though these are strange times that we live in, they are definitely no stranger than in ages past. Until next time.